Hey, what's happening everybody? How are you doing? This is Rob of Rule of Two Review. Welcome back to the channel. I hope you are having a fantastic day. And today, yes, we are back to talking more about Metroid, Metroid Dread, some big theories and concepts and ideas that I have. The focus of today's conversation actually has to do with Metroid Dread and if there could possibly be any story connection between Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime 4. Now, if you're a big Metroid nerd like myself, and I'm sure a lot of you guys out there watching who are very familiar with the Metroid series, the story, the lore, and the timeline, you know that initially it might sound kind of weird to think about Metroid Dread's story having any impact on Metroid Prime 4 or vice versa. The quick and dirty version, for anyone who might be new to the franchise or unfamiliar with this, is that really the Metroid timeline, honestly, as much as I love it and I know it inside and out, it is pretty messy and pretty sloppily put together. And so we know that Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime 4 are the two current Metroid games being worked on. However, they take place, at least we assume, very far apart within the timeline. Now, before I continue to break this down and discuss the Metroid timeline and possible story connections between Dread and Metroid Prime 4, I do like to always remind you guys that I'm trying to grow the channel here on Rule of Two Review. I upload several videos every single week, and I live stream once a week. I cover all things Nintendo, I discuss every single possible thing about Metroid, and I cover all things gaming. So as you watch this video, if you seem to like what I'm doing and what you hear, then I hope you will consider subscribing to the channel. So like I was saying, based on where we assume Metroid Prime 4 will take place, the events in Metroid Prime 4 and the events in Metroid Dread should be actually very far apart within the timeline. And so one would think that the stories won't have really too much specific connection. Maybe the loose connections, like the fact that obviously Samus is the star, and her adventure in every game does technically relate to every other game. But I'm talking about the bigger picture stuff, and I think that there's a chance Nintendo might be doing some unique things with Metroid Prime 4 that could allow for the story to have more of an impact on Metroid Dread. So at its core, what we're looking at is that within the entire Metroid timeline, yes, the Metroid Prime series of games and the numbered Metroid games, 1, 2, 3, 4, and now 5 with Dread, are all within the same timeline. That also includes another spin-off like Metroid Other M, and even the other portable games like Metroid Prime Hunters and Federation Force. Like, they're technically all canon, and they are all within the same timeline, but we do have the two overall kind of continual series within the Metroid franchise. The numbered games 1 through 5, and the Metroid Prime series, which was previously a trilogy of games, Metroid Primes 1, 2, and 3, and will now also include Metroid Prime 4 when that game releases. Of course, Metroid Dread is Metroid 5, so that puts us at the end of the timeline, the furthest in Samus's adventure we will finally see. And then we also have the Metroid Prime games, again the trilogy, now the quadrilogy. And the original 3 Metroid Prime games actually take place between Metroids 1 and 2. So again, to kind of simplify this, Metroid Dread is number 5, but between number 1 and 2 is when the Metroid Prime trilogy actually happens. And so it's pretty safe to assume that Metroid Prime 4, being a sequel to Metroid Prime 3, will probably take place directly after the events of Metroid Prime 3, which would also put that in the past well before Metroid Dread even takes place. And I'm realizing as I continue to talk about this, you guys, how kind of messy and convoluted and maybe awkward it is to explain this. If you already know this stuff and you're familiar with the Metroid timeline, this isn't a challenge for you. But as a lot of us know, Metroid Dread has so much hype and excitement behind it, and because the Switch itself is so popular, that a lot of people are actually jumping on board with the Metroid franchise now because of Metroid Dread, either going back and only just now starting to play some of the prior games and learn the franchise, or waiting for Metroid Dread to release and making that their first Metroid game. So it is awkward to explain a kind of messy and confusing timeline to people who might not yet know it the way myself and a lot of you other super huge Metroid fans might already know. And so with that whole mess behind us, let's move forward now and actually talk about why I think there could be a story connection between Metroid Prime 4 and Metroid Dread. And there's a lot behind why I think that this might happen. One has to do with when Metroid Prime 4 itself might take place. The other has to do kind of more on the business or the logistical side of things, and maybe the decision to delay and restart Metroid Prime 4 and scrap the original version being worked on, which probably happened around the time they were gearing up to make Metroid Dread. And what if part of that overall business decision to delay and restart Metroid Prime 4 with a different team actually had something to do with the fact that they were also then deciding to move on and make a Metroid 5. And so maybe from a story perspective, within the writers' rooms of the entire Metroid franchise, did they decide to say, okay, the first version of Prime 4 wasn't working, let's scrap that, let's start over with Retro Studios, let's begin a new story, and we also want to make this Metroid 5 game, and we want to revive the Dread concept and move that forward. Is there a way, while we're already deciding to restart Metroid Prime 4 anyway, to kind of make these games work together to add more story and color and history and lore to Samus and the overall Metroid franchise at the same time? And so obviously, as you can tell, my personal theory is yes. I think that maybe they did decide to do that, to start the development of the new version of Prime 4 and Metroid Dread around the same time. The writers and the lore keepers of the Metroid franchise, Sakamoto probably being one of them, deciding, hey, let's tie these two games into each other. We've got a new Nintendo, a new Switch. We're more popular and successful than we've ever been before. It's a great time to revive Metroid and make Samus matter again. And why not take two huge Metroid releases and make them connect to each other? I really think that there's a chance that that's what they're doing. I could be wrong. There's a great chance that Metroid Prime 4 comes out. It's just a simple, straightforward sequel to Metroid Prime 3, and it has nothing to do with the events of Dread and vice versa. Obviously, that could happen. But for me, it's fun to theorize and speculate on if there is a plan to connect these stories. Now, while there's a couple of ways that they could do that, the one that I think makes the most sense and that I would actually kind of like to see them do would be if they actually set Metroid Prime 4 way after the events of the initial Metroid Prime trilogy, as in closer to the events of Metroid Dread. Now that might sound silly, and it might even sound impossible to you, but I really think it could happen. I mean, if you think about it, yeah, it makes sense for Metroid Prime 4 to just take place right after Metroid Prime 3 way in the past, but it's not impossible for them to move it around within the timeline. The entire purpose of this game's story is literally in the hands of the writers. So the writers have all the autonomy and authority in the world to place Metroid Prime 4 wherever they want. And it could literally take place after Metroid Dread in the timeline, but still be narratively a successor to Metroid Prime 3. It could still be a sequel to Prime 3, even if it takes place way down the line within the timeline. A great example would be the two Star Wars trilogies, whereas the prequel trilogy ends with Revenge of the Sith, and the direct sequel from Episode 3 to Episode 4, which is A New Hope, takes place 19 years, almost 20 years after the fact. And so, an outsider looking into the Star Wars Skywalker saga could see that huge gap and be like, oh, they're two unrelated stories, there's 20 years apart from one story to another, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, no, like, if you pay attention to the narrative of those 6 movies, literally between Part 3 and Part 4, that 20-year gap doesn't prevent Part 4 from being a sequel to Part 3, right? Lordy, I feel like the more I talk about this stuff, it kind of, you know, I feel like my brain is that Charlie Day meme of him staring and pointing at the board with the messy hair and all the yarn trying to connect stuff. It's a very awkward thing to explain with your words, and I'm not a graphic design guy that can create animations to make this stuff make more sense visually to you guys. I'm literally describing all of these examples with my words, and I think that it's probably going to come across sort of confusing and messy, but it's really the only way to talk about it, a weird timeline like the Metroid timeline. So hopefully it makes sense and is still entertaining and informative to you guys, because it is a lot of fun for me to talk about this stuff. So the numbered mainline Metroid series 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and I also would include Other M, as the events in that game are more tied to that series, the overall mainline story, even though it is also a spin-off in its own right. But the main games, 1 through 5, really focus on Samus and the Metroids and what eventually becomes the X-Parasite, and the Galactic Federation, and now also introducing the Emmy robots, right? So that's been the main focus. There has been an attempt in recent releases, the Zero Mission remake, the Samus Returns remake, and also in Metroid Fusion, to also kind of start to drip feed some Chozo stuff, right? I mean, Metroid Dread we know is going to have some serious Chozo implication and stories going on there, because there's even a living Chozo in the game. Now, the Metroid Prime series, previously the 3 games, soon to be the 4th game, not including the handheld spin-offs here, that's been focused on Samus and the space pirates and the Phazon material, and also the Metroid Prime entity and the Dark Samus entity, right? So you've got the numbered main series, which is Metroids and X-Parasites and GFS, and you've got the Prime series, which is Space Pirates and Phazon and Metroid Prime itself. And there's a lot of kind of cross-contamination of storylines across all of the games, but those are kind of how the stories really overall separate themselves. Now, I did also briefly mention the Chozo here a little bit, and obviously the Chozo have had a presence throughout the entire series, but they really have had their biggest presence and impact in the Metroid Prime series, right? We see some imagery in the Chozo statues that give Samus her power-ups in all the main numbered games, but we haven't really seen anything else from them. In the Prime series, the Chozo, the writings about their history and lore, how even the Luminoth and Metroid Prime 2 have a connection, and just a lot of the history and the scan logs that you read throughout the Prime saga has to do with the Chozo. You even go to the Chozo ruins in the original Metroid Prime, and there are Chozo statues and temples that you go to within those games. You even fight Chozo ghost enemies within those games. So the Chozo have been mostly tied to the Metroid Prime series of games. But now with Metroid Dread coming along and showing us that they are all about the Chozo in that game, that's one of the things that really started to get me thinking about how Metroid Prime 4 was being made, got scrapped, restarted with Retro, then we get the Dread announcement, we see the Chozo in Metroid Dread, we already know the Prime saga has so much more to do with the Chozo than the numbered games, and I'm like, why wouldn't they be tying these together? Not to mention the fact, and this is a huge piece to me as well, you guys, the fact that Sakamoto and Nintendo have confirmed that Metroid Dread represents the end of this overall story arc in Samus's intertwined fates with the Metroids, and that they are working on future chapters that begin new chapters down the road. If Metroid Dread represents the end, but Metroid Prime 4 is also releasing after Metroid Dread, that makes it weird to me, and so that's when I started to think that even though Metroid Dread might represent the end, what if Metroid Prime 4 takes place after the events of Metroid Dread, making it the new furthest in the timeline we go, and it both wraps up the plight with the space pirates and the Phazon and the Chozo and all that from the Prime games, but also wraps up the X-Parasite and the Chozo stuff that Samus goes through in Metroid Dread, and becomes the actual new end to the saga, whereas after Prime 4, that's when the new chapters will truly begin. I know that these are big, wild, and out there theories and ideas that I'm putting out there, and it's also really hard because we don't know what the final story of Metroid Dread will be because it's still a couple of months away from release, and we know literally nothing about Metroid Prime 4. So again, Metroid Prime 4's first trailer, whenever we see that, could completely shoot this entire theory in the foot, and maybe it's going to release after Metroid Dread, but it's just another game in the past that has no real bearing on Metroid Dread. I think it would be weird to do that with Metroid Prime 4, because I also think it's going to be the bigger, more successful and popular game. And it's weird to do that with the game releasing after Metroid Dread, so the decision for Metroid Dread to be the end of the story, the way Sakamoto puts it, also makes the whole thing between Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime 4 very strange. And so all of these factors that I've been blabbing about to you in this video is what made me think, with Metroid Prime 4 releasing after Dread releases, why wouldn't they tie the stories together, set Metroid Prime 4 in the future, connect the X-Parasite and the Chozo and the Metroid and the Phazon and Samus all together in one final game, being Metroid Prime 4, to then set us off on a course for future chapters and a new journey within the saga. You know, it's only a guess that could be wrong, but it just makes so much sense to me in the here and now with the limited information we have about both games. Granted, we have a lot more info about Metroid Dread than we do about Metroid Prime 4, including the 3 Metroid Dread reports, the trailer, the footage, the treehouse, the confirmation of the living Chozo. I mean, all of this stuff, there's a lot going on, and I feel like I have this kind of frenetic, unorganized energy in this video simply because my mind as a Metroid fan is actually bursting at the seams with ideas and theories, you know? I mean, I wonder if that comes across in a video topic and a conversation like this. I'm literally blowing up inside of my head about what I think could be happening and also what I want to happen. I'm excited about all of it. We are living in the best time right now because Metroid is being revived with an exciting new game. But knowing that before the end of this year, all of our hype and mystery about Metroid Dread will be done and we will start looking ahead to Metroid Prime 4, that's what just makes me keep thinking about this stuff and theorizing about it in my own brain. So, I don't know, man. Like I said, I feel like I've been all over the place in this video, but these are just some of the big ideas I'm thinking about, and I hope that there's a story connection with the Chozo and the Phazon and Samus and the Metroids between Dread and Prime 4. And, you know, it's only a matter of time before we eventually find out if there's any truth to that or not. So, these are my big crazy thoughts for right now, and as more information comes out, we'll know if there's any truth to this or not, and I can make updated theories as we get new information. So, yeah, maybe sometime in the future, whether it's months or years, we learn that everything I said today is absolute crap and means nothing. But right now, we don't know if that's true, so that's why it's fun to speculate about it right now at the end of July 2021. So this is what I think could be happening. I'm hoping for a story connection between Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime 4. Let me know what you guys think. If you are a longtime Metroid fan who knows this stuff in the timeline like I do, I obviously want to hear what you think about my theory and if you think there's something to it or if you've got different theories. And if you're new to Metroid, what do you think about this stuff? Is this overwhelming to you? Is this stuff that maybe makes you more excited to get into the franchise? I want to hear what you have to say as well. And so with that, this video is a wrap. Thanks, of course, as always, for tuning in, guys. This is Rob of Rule of 2 Review, and I'll catch you next time on another video.